organizer for the Behavioural OR stream, which is just a session in this conference, this virtual conference. Thank you for coming. As you can see, we have 3 speakers, Sean, Katarina, and Vincent. I will introduce them in turn. What they all have in common is that they co-authored a chapter in the new and exciting Handbook of Behavioural OR that's coming out. I'm going to say more about that also in a minute when Katarina's talk comes. But first, Sean, if you could advance to the slide about housekeeping very quickly. Thank you. So before I hand over to Sean, you've probably seen those things already from your other sessions. You can browse through them very quickly. The most important thing is try when you have a question to use the Q&A function. Don't put them on the chat. The Q&A function is the correct one. I'll be monitoring them during all the talks because the speakers obviously cannot. And then I will try to organize the discussion after each presentation. So that's it. Again, thank you very much for coming. We're looking forward to it. So it's over to you, Sean. Sean Manzi from the University of Exeter.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos, and welcome everybody to this session and to our first talk. I'm going to be talking today about the importance of human behaviour in practice with insights from the modelling cycle. And so just to give you a little bit of background about me, I'm a research fellow at the University of Exeter within the PENCORD team there, which sits within the NIHR ARC, the applied research collaboration there. And our role is to work directly with the NHS on getting research into practice and using insights from modelling projects to make changes and improvements within the healthcare sector. So in terms of my experience, I'm talking from more of a healthcare background. So today I'm going to be focusing on chapter 10 of the new Behavioural Operational Research Handbook, a capabilities approach, more of which we'll hear about later. And the focus of this chapter really, and the talk today, is about eliciting useful information about behaviour in a system from stakeholders. And then being able to use that information, using that information, whether it's in the model building process or in actually building the model itself. And all of this is kind of building towards giving yourself the best chance of a successful project. And when I talk about success, I'm really talking about gaining implementation, actually making changes in practice. That's the key aim. That's what we're all after. We want to use our modelling to be able to make improvements in the real world. And it's these kind of implied insights that I'm going to try and draw on today. So my first point is really operational research is much more than model building. It sits within this whole ecosystem of improvement and change within any organisation. And so there's a whole lot of different aspects to it. And these whenever you're driving change within an organisation, it's about behaviour. It's about changing behaviour. And so understanding behaviour is central to success of an OR project. And understanding behaviour needs to be throughout the whole modelling process, from start to finish. And everybody that's working on a project, or linked to a project, any of your stakeholders within a project, they've all got different perspectives on what changes should be made, how they should be implemented, what a problem might be within a system, and even how the system functions. So we need to be able to understand how all these different divergent behaviours and perspectives impact on the problem situation, the functioning of the system, and then use these findings to generate workable solutions. So the modelling cycle. You've probably all seen this, this diagram before, simple diagram, but I put a few extra bits into this. When we're talking about problem, starting with a problem, that's what we're aiming to solve with our project, with our model. And during that, getting to understand what the problem is, we need to develop a shared understanding with our clients, our stakeholders, between everybody that's working on that project, to understand, first of all, what the problem is. And then once we've got an understanding of what the problem is, we need to understand what the problem, the actual system itself looks like. So we develop a conceptual model, and this needs to be full of shared understanding about how the system is actually functioning. Once we've developed a conceptual model, that needs to be translated then into a formal model. And this translation process needs the input from stakeholders. It's their behaviour which is going to determine whether they actually trust the formal model. It's going to give it credibility. It needs validity for it to actually be a useful tool to generate solutions. So from the formal model, we're then gaining our results and generating solutions. But those results need to be interpreted. And again, it's the stakeholders that have to come in and really interpret our results and give them context in order to find meaningful solutions that are actually going to lead to implementation. So I'm going to talk about some different points around the modeling cycle now, and just some real pragmatic pointers around how to get the best out of your stakeholders and working with behaviour throughout the modelling cycle. So in problem structuring, we need to understand if and how behaviour might be present in the problem situation. And normally in most applied projects, there's going to be some form of behaviour present within your system. These types of problems are applied when they're given the term complex, messy, or wicked. That's a pretty good indication that there's going to be some kind of behaviour that is present within the system. We can use different problem structuring methods to identify what the problem is and if behaviour might be part of the problem, as it quite often is. And I've just kind of listed out here kind of stakeholder analysis, a good way to understand who actually needs to be involved in your project. Your client will often approach you just individually as one person, as a small part of the system that they're trying to change, or as a representative of the overall system. But you've got to bring in everybody else that's going to be relevant to that. Root cause analysis is a great one to be able to try and understand what the actual root of your problem is. What is it that's causing the issue? Causal loop diagrams can be useful to try and understand what the different factors are that are influencing it. And process mapping to understand kind of what the system looks like. But these, I'd never say they should be used as solid methods and just applied to something, because actually we tend to do them in more of an ad hoc manner in the real world when undertaking an applied project. So yeah, they can help us understand what the problem is, but it also generates shared understanding of the problem. And that's the really key bit. So even in your discussions with stakeholders, if you can get them to think about the root causes of their problems, who else needs to be involved, different factors influencing, it helps them all build consensus around what the problem is. And it's developing trust between your stakeholders so that they can trust each other's perspectives is useful. So once we manage to understand what the problem is, we move on to conceptual modelling, and it's about generating a shared understanding of the system. System function in human systems, it's often subjective. It comes from the person's perspective within that system. And stakeholders will only understand the function of the system from their position within the system. And that's where the formal procedures are present or not, because systems don't normally function by formal procedures, especially human systems. And so the role of the OR practitioner is kind of to elicit what the actual function of the system is and not how it should function. How it should function is what you get onto at the end. And no one person is going to know how the entire system actually functions. If you're ever process mapping with just one person, you're probably getting a skewed view of the system. And it's the role of the OR practitioner to, again, integrate all these different multiple perspectives and to work with stakeholders to arrive at a mutually agreeable representation of the system. So once we've got a conceptual model, it's got to be translated into a formal model. And it's down to the skill of the model builder to create the model that provides the solution to the stakeholder's problem. And that model needs to be is determined by the data that's available, the type of problem, the level at which you're looking at it. So there's a lot that the model builder needs to take from these previous problem defining the problem situation and the conceptual modeling phases. Behavior is often implicit in a model, and so it's not often explicitly modeled, but where it is explicitly modeled, such as if you've got decision-making rules within a model, then validating these rules with stakeholders helps to create credibility. And that's absolutely essential for stakeholders trusting the outputs of the model. It's not useful to show stakeholders model code or equations. I've just got to put a couple of examples up on the slide. One is a decision-making model. This is a process map of what is several hundred lines of code, producing a sequential sampling model for decision-making. Using things like process maps, if then else statements, word equations. Word equations are brilliant if you've got to present complex equations to people. And animated demonstration models. It allows a non-expert stakeholder to really engage with the formal model and understand what's happening. So once we've managed to develop the formal model and getting stakeholders to understand how the model's been built, getting them to validate the model and validate the outputs and see that it does relate to their actual system is a really useful way to get them to trust what's happening and increase the credibility of your model in their eyes. A really interesting point with generating solutions, we quite often, when we're building a model, we want to get the best solution, find the optimal solution, the one that's going to produce the best savings, whether those are monetary or efficiency savings. But actually, that's probably not necessarily the best solution for the client. Developing satisficing solutions, those solutions that satisfy stakeholder needs should be the aim. And again, this is a real key part of understanding behavior when undertaking an OR project, that actually knowing what the stakeholder needs are politically, commercially, you've got to understand what they're aiming to get out of it and what they can realistically do within their system and the limitations placed on them by the organisation that they work for. The feasibility of implementation will influence whether a solution is used in practice. So coming up with, in the case of a hospital, a solution that needs 20 more staff is definitely going to be less appetizing to a client than one that perhaps requires investment in only one new piece of equipment. there's always going to be trade-offs. Interestingly, recently undertook a pilot study with some colleagues in Germany, and we looked at emergency service planning for the location and routing of ambulance services. And we were looking at, with optimization models, what kind of solutions they like in the presentation of that information. And we asked them if they would prefer just one possible solution, like the best solution, or multiple solutions to choose from. Those that we surveyed, 19 of them preferred multiple solutions and only 4 wanted just a single solution. But when we asked them how many solutions would they like from a location planning model or a routing model, then they said they'd like a minimum of between 2 and 5 solutions. And given that an optimization model often produces hundreds of thousands of possible solutions, it's really important to understand which solutions to present to your stakeholders. And again, this comes back to understanding their needs and having plenty of solutions. It's an ongoing discussion. It can't just be giving a report to somebody and expecting the solutions that are given in that report to be the right ones for the client. So we got solutions, but the project doesn't end there. It's all about gaining implementation. Ensuring the organisational cultural relevance of the model and the solutions are going to really help boost the credibility and the trust that your client has in the solutions. They're going to see them as workable and usable. The more that you can help stakeholders to relate to the model, having a key core stakeholder group throughout the process really helps with that. Getting all the stakeholders to a consensus. Consensus building is really difficult, and it's something that takes years of practice to really engage people and bring them together under a common goal and a common idea. Really important is actually balancing internal dynamics between stakeholders, that people will have issues, there'll be internal politics, and you've got to try and navigate that in order to get your solution implemented within an organization so that you have had a successful project. So thinking about just a few concluding points, thinking about problem structuring, work with stakeholders to understand the relevance of behaviour to the system. When going through then into conceptual modelling, collaborate with multiple stakeholders to understand the behavioural processes that might be present within the system, but also continue working with them to build and develop consensus around the model. In the formal modelling, make sure you're using the right modelling approach for the data that you have available. That's probably something I don't have to say, but ensure stakeholders can understand the internal dynamics of the model. Involving them in the model validation process has been demonstrated to be absolutely key to that. And when generating solutions, allow stakeholders to determine appropriate satisficing solutions, and that will hopefully give you the best chance of implementation at the end. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I think we're taking questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Sean, for this very broad overview. I took a little bit of your time in the beginning, so I will also give you some of the time now, especially Katarina has indicated she needs perhaps a little less time. So let me go through the questions in the Q&A. I have to pick some. I cannot ask all of them because there are a few. First, when you were talking about the conceptual modeling and problem structuring approach in order to get that done, one of the questions has to do with how about inputs such as rich pictures? I like that one. Rich pictures, how do they feature in?
Rich pictures can be a really nice way to capture what are quite ad hoc systems, actually. I find people's ability to describe what they do and bring that together. If it works, if it's something that you feel your stakeholders will respond to. Some people prefer more formal, structured approaches. Some people enjoy the pictures and the narrative and being able to tell a story. This is something that works well with soft systems, integrating soft systems and rich pictures to be able to understand more informal behaviour around systems. And I know Sonia Crow's done quite a bit of work around this, so I put you to that.
Questions keep coming in. I have to pick. I'm assuming that later we can go back to them and you and I, Sean, can respond in writing. But let me pick the last one that just came in, which was also in my mind. So the trust equation was very good. Was that lifted?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Or is it from previous wisdom where we can learn more about this trust equation?
I'll pop that in the chat.
Okay, all right. Well, now I was tempted to ask one more question, but I don't think we have time. So thank you very much, Sean. And now it's over to Katarina. Let me quickly say, I promised that in the beginning too, I wanted to say a couple more things about the stream and the behavioral OR special interest group in particular of the OR Society. So the special interest group is very active, except and featuring people like Katarina and myself, and John Malpas and Richard Underwood. We also organize events. Of course, this year, the two events we had scheduled, one was at Loughborough University together with the Manchester Business School on AI and decision making and how can behavioral science and behavioral help. Of course, we postponed that and now we're going to see what we're going to do. That's one. Another thing is there will be the first ever NatCore, National Training Center for OR course in behavioral OR coming up virtually, of course, January 1822. So you can figure all these details out from the NatCore website, and there will be also information coming up in the behavioral OR special interest group. And of course, to get back to Katarina, we do have the second handbook in behavioral OR. As I said in the beginning, for those of you who missed it, the theme for this session is that all three talks that you're going to be listening to are chapters in that book. So if you like the talks, maybe you like the whole book as well. So now it's over to Katarina.
Okay, thank you. Let me try and share the screen. I hope you can all see that. Yeah? Okay, good. So good afternoon. The question that I will try to address in this talk is how a problem structuring intervention might change the participants' capability to change their status quo. So I'll start by situating the work in behavioral OR, and then I'll introduce a theoretical perspective, which is called social practice theory. And then I'll move on to a case study to illustrate what that looks like in practice. So first of all, if we think about behavioral operational research, it's really grown as an area of interest, and it uses insights from behavioral sciences, social psychology, and sociology in studying the effects of cultural and cognitive and emotional factors on our thinking and acting with analytical methods. And if we think about it systematically, we suggest that we can distinguish 4 different domains along the axis that distinguish between competence, by which we mean skills, and knowledge, and capabilities, which also include the opportunity to put some skills into practice. And it is within this area around capabilities within the model, which really focuses on understanding the relationship between models and behavior, and taking into account the impact of individual and collective behavior that my work sits. And this is what I'm going to focus on. So to give a bit more background, again, the question that I'm trying to explore further with social practice theory is how this intervention can change the participants' capability to improve their own situation, their perceived problematic situation. And this is a really old question, raised obviously by Rosenhead in 1989. And these problem structuring methods, which have been used widely in practice, are still facing this efficacy puzzle. So the question around the complex situational interplay of individual and collective behaviors and how that can be better understood. And there's been a call for new theoretical perspectives to bridge this gap between participants and their context and the methods themselves. And this is where the work connects with social practice theory. And I'm suggesting that this is one of the theoretical perspectives that might be useful in helping us understand the efficacy of these methods. So social practice theory is really one theory in a palette of approaches, and practice-based theorizing is probably best seen as an integrative approach that considers the socialized individual in context, and it looks at socio-material and culturally embedded processes of capability development, really. And particularly as it considers the way in which they are expressed in habitual ways of doing and being. And social practice theory offers this conceptual framework of three different areas: meanings, materials, and competencies. And with competencies being core, it still argues that it is only when they are enacted, so meanings, materials, and competencies together, that we may have a practice that we can improve upon, for example, by rearranging the elements within these practice frameworks. It allows us, if we think about its utility for understanding the efficacy of problem structuring methods, I argue, to study both content and process of a problem structuring method. So it sharpens our awareness for the question, how do different actors interact to shape their joint capability to act in a problematic situation, and focuses both on the interactions, the struggles for meaning, but also the experimental putting together. So it bridges between work on affordances and the work on social process and mental models. And this is why I think it's a really interesting perspective. Now, the workshop that I'll talk about, and I really have to thank Professor Mike Yearworth at Exeter University, who did all the hard work of running the workshop, for me to then be able to observe this. It's a case study research, a project that focused on sustainable urban redevelopment with the same local authority and the same core stakeholders over many years. So I'm focusing less on the method here and more on what we can see if we think about what happened during these workshops, what happened during the participatory modeling. And there was a diverse set of stakeholders in the room. So people from the local authority, third sector, universities, engineers from different consultancies, and jointly they identified 4 key problem areas. So we have here technological and commercial feasibility, but also transport, and all of these jointly, if we think about, we videotape these workshops about what happened during their modeling process, really surface an implicit business model thinking. So we can think about what they did there as a sustainable business model practice workshop. And I'll go into a bit more detail now about how these ideas about meanings, materials, and competencies help us to perhaps see more clearly the dynamics of what happened during the workshop. In what ways may there have been some micro shifts in the behavior of the participants through the modeling process. So this slide is really my suggestion about what we can see when we look at the workshop through the lens of social practice theory. And there are 3 different aspects, again, focusing on competencies, meanings, and materials. The first is perhaps more focused on the content. So when we think about competencies in the room and the different knowledge areas that people brought to bear on the question of developing this low carbon sustainable area in this particular city, they used concepts such as customer segments and channels and how they can connect customers technologically and contractually, what the key supply partners might be and their activities and resources. So they also used models related to formalized alliances and agreements about funding and financing, essentially with the competences that they had, the skills and knowledge in this particular area. What this modeling process allowed them to do is to surface the implicit institutional logics in this particularly complex problem situation. And this is enabled, obviously, through the material aspect of the modeling process. So the ability to make public and productive the concepts that they are grappling with, that are in their individual understandings of their domains, but that become explicit when they have to change them around on the modeling, on the shared modeling surface. And so it challenges, it allows participants to challenge what the problem is represented to be. And this is where the meanings aspect comes in. By having this shared surface, in this case, just a low-tech flip chart, but by allowing people to make these concepts explicit and allowing them to question the legitimacy of which concepts should be represented in the future model, the future-oriented model, we have a kind of renegotiation of meanings. So to make this clearer, perhaps rather than having a business as usual model for the redevelopment zone, we may have a replacement of the technology with sort of photovoltaics and particular competencies around their installation. So this is a change in the materials in this particular practice that may then lead to perhaps an initialization of new practices of redevelopment in the real world. So with this lens of social practice theory, it is possible to see how these very well-known processes that occur within a problem structuring intervention come together in order to, in order to help participants to develop these future-oriented constellations, which we hope gain some traction when they take them further beyond the workshop. So to sum up, how might problem structuring intervention influence the participants' capability to change their status quo? Through these three different perspectives, material, meaning, and social, which cannot be separated but are intertwined in practice, we really are able to see how the individual thinking connects to a collective level, because the model is no longer attributable to just one single participant, and how the process of deciding what is represented in the model and how the elements are related to each other constitutes the opportunity to renegotiate the meanings, which is the second element of the practice, and really how the relationship building in the workshop and the surfacing of the different meanings and the realization that these meanings are not facts, that they can be challenged, allows participants to build some capability to jointly move towards the aim of this workshop, develop a more sustainable redevelopment approach. Okay, that's it from me.
Fantastic, Katarina, really on time. So we have time for a few questions that already appeared on the chat. I also have my own, and there could be space also for one or two more questions. So okay. The first question reads verbatim: do you see more integration of OR with sociology in the future? And I would also add, of course, social psychology, other of these more social behavioral sciences.
Do I see more? I think there's a long history. So OR and the social sciences, there were conferences in, I think, the 60s and then the 90s again. So I don't think it's necessarily a new phenomenon to draw on sociology. But what I'm keen to see more of is the theories of socio-material becoming. So it's not, or I suppose it's a particular area of sociology that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a little bit like the reintroductory article of Franco and Hamalainen, where they said return to the roots, right? That's in your first handbook of OR. Okay, moving on. How do modeling and simulation could help to improve stakeholders' knowledge of a problematic situation?
I think some of the most exciting work is work around participatory simulation, so engaging stakeholders in the workshop of, in the process of becoming agents in a dynamic model, and putting themselves into these positions, thinking about why they do what they're doing and how this could be represented. I think that can really help. So I know there was a session yesterday around the relevance of scenarios, and I haven't caught up with that yet. But I think, of course, scenario-based planning and thinking is also something that might help. in terms of imagining future practices and questioning the status quo.
Okay, yes, participatory simulation. I'm going to go back to the previous question because there was a comment on the previous question to which you already answered, and I made some comments, but the comment is interesting. It's provocative, and as I said, we still have time. So I'm reading it again because it's a long one. I don't want to misinterpret. It's an interesting one, your question, because social research comes from such a different worldview. I think that if you're going to apply that thinking properly, then you mustn't start with the assumption that the inquiry will lead to an OR model.
Okay, so I suppose it's a question of, I would probably go back to Jacqueline, whether we distinguish between hard and soft systems there. And if I think Jonathan Flowers, if I see this correctly, asked the question around an OR model. And if the assumption is that that is a hard systems model, then it is still a social process that is involved in developing this model. And this is where sociology comes in. So our models don't stand outside of our own practices, I would argue.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I don't know if we have the capability for Jonathan to jump in. We have the time. Justin, is that possible or no? Only written. Okay. Sorry about that, putting people on the spot. I thought we could have a real discussion like when we see each other in person. There's more questions. Another one that seems quite rich, so I'm reading it again. Catherine, a very interesting approach to problem structuring. It struck me that you referred to content and process without mentioning context, which is at the heart of praxeology, where shared understanding is made. Are you able to say how you take account of context in generating meaning for your model?
So the slides which I had earlier, which said there is nothing outside of practice, would imply that context is that which is enacted as participants are modeling. So I wouldn't see this as an exogenous aspect of the modeling process that needs to be taken into account beyond what the meaning is that participants give the concepts and the models that they develop. But I'm very happy to catch up on that question and find out more about praxeology.
Yeah, with Anthony. I also wanted to say I thought context was featured because, for example, you said, which one was it? About one of your activities, you said it's definitely a situated activity. So using my background in cognitive science, situation awareness, it's often considered synonymous with context awareness. But
yeah, I mean, I wonder if that question refers a bit to maybe a temporal view. So what goes on beyond the workshop and how these early problem structuring phases might be taken into real world change and action. So that's why I'd be interested to find out more.
Mm-hmm. But maybe you can take it offline.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. In the Q&A, as you can all see, there's an answer to the question by Jonathan, to the first question by Martin Cook, and Martin Cook has answered. You can all see it. Thank you very much, Katarina, for a very lively, very well managed session. So I think now we are ready to move on to Vincent. Vincent, again, has a chapter in the upcoming Handbook of Behavioural OR. He's from Radboud University in the Netherlands. Over to you, Vincent.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. Hi, everyone. My name is Vincent de Gooyert, and I'm an assistant professor in research methods at Radboud University, Nijmegen, the Netherlands. And today I'm presenting out of Utrecht, a lovely city right in the middle of the Netherlands. And I'm very glad to present another chapter from the Behavioral Operational Research Handbook. What I really like about behavioral operational research is that it tries to draw from other literatures, social scientific literatures, to enrich operational research. And as has already been said, this has been going on since the start of operational research. So it's really going back to the roots. But yeah, I think there's still much left to uncover for us in the rich social scientific literature. And in this particular chapter, I try to draw from stakeholder theory. It's stream of literature that yeah, you can really be traced back to the book by Edward Freeman in 1984 on strategic management, a stakeholder approach. And stakeholder theory since then developed into very different branches. Some branches are very descriptive. They look at organizations that try to involve stakeholders, to engage stakeholders, and they try to identify which results can be expected as a consequence. There's also the more instrumental stakeholder theory, where methods are prescribed on how you should involve stakeholders, how you can do that, how you can engage stakeholders. And there's also the more normative literature, which is about why should we engage and involve stakeholders. And in this chapter, I try to draw from that literature and connect it to our practice in operational research. But I'm also very eager to learn how this might compare to your own experience with applying operational research and from your own practice of engaging stakeholders while working on operational research projects. Yeah, behavioral operational research is about behavior in general. It works in several ways. The implications of behavior on models, but also the other way around. How can we model behavior? What happens if humans start using the models that we've produced? But also what happens if we try to model humans as part of the systems that we try to improve. Yeah, in operational research, since the start, the relevance of stakeholders has widely been acknowledged. So there's a lot of recognition that the stakeholders are relevant, and it's the main aim of many of our projects to improve a situation that someone finds itself, him or herself in. So if that stakeholder is not satisfied in the end, then why did we embark on this project in the first place? So the relevance is widely acknowledged, but what the exact relevance is, what are the exact implications of stakeholders in the context of operational research project, that's not always discussed specifically or explicitly. So sometimes it's assumed to be clear to the reader why stakeholders were involved, how, and also which stakeholders. There can be many. So in this presentation, I tried to draw from stakeholder theory to discuss those questions and to relate them to the different lines of argumentation that have been brought forward in stakeholder theory. So this presentation revolves around those three questions. Why should we involve stakeholders in operational research in the first place? And if we decide to involve them, who do we involve? And then thirdly, how to involve those stakeholders. And my main point then going to make here is that the answers to those three questions are related. So who should you involve? Well, it depends on why you want to involve stakeholders. And how do you involve stakeholders? Well, that depends on who you involve and why you involve them. I'm trying to argue that the answer to those three questions are related. So the answer on one of those questions will also determine the answer that you want to give to other questions. So, question, why stakeholders? Well, there can be many reasons, and those reasons are overlap and rumors of a project. Your motive can change, and You probably have many reasons to involve stakeholders usually, but let's try to distinguish a couple of reasons anyway. So what kind of reasons could you have for involving stakeholders? Well, one is improve this quality. Operational research is the science of better decision making, and sometimes you can get to a better decision if you involve stakeholders. For example, well, as Sean already expressed in the first presentation, in messy, problems, complex, wicked situations, there's not a single expert that has all the knowledge that is necessary to come up with a good solution. So involving stakeholders can then help to come up with a better solution compared to the situation where you did not involve different stakeholders with different worldviews. So it's a way of collecting more data, right? Collecting the different viewpoints from different stakeholders. A very different motive can be building consensus, also touched upon by Sean, especially if there is a chance of running into resistance. If you're afraid that implementing your preferred solution in the end is frustrated by stakeholders that do not agree with that solution, well, that can be a motive to involve stakeholders as well. So yeah, we know from literature on procedural justice, for example, that if stakeholders perceive the procedure that led up to the recommendation as fair, there's a lower chance that it will resist the implementation of the solution, even if they disagree with the solution, even if it's not their preferred solution. So building consensus is a motive in itself. It's more on also on values. So what do the stakeholders find important compared to, in the first motive, collecting information, collecting data without necessarily discussing the relevance and implications of those data in terms of the values that the stakeholders might adhere to. So a third motive, improving relationships. So building consensus and improving decision quality is all very related to the topic, the messy problem at hand. But the typical characteristic of messy problems is that you cannot solve them. You can attempt to solve them. You can address a messy problem, try to tame it. But in many cases, you will find that new unintended consequences are introduced as a consequence of the interventions that came out of your operational research project. And then you find yourself in a new messy problem, which is different, but chances are high that you run into the same stakeholders. So improving relationships can be a motive to involve stakeholders in itself, without necessarily having the fear that they might resist the implementation of the solution in this specific project, or without necessarily them having a lot of knowledge on this specific messy problem. It can still be a good idea to involve them if you expect to run into the same stakeholders in a future situation. If you have, if you mutually depend on each other for successfully taming messy problems over time, multiple messy problems over time, it might be a good idea to invest in that relationship, even if the current problem in itself doesn't require it. So in general, you can use stakeholder engagement to increase trust and to achieve improved cooperation. And the fourth reason, this is not a priority, this is not showing the priority of the motives. The fourth reason can also be the most important reason, the intrinsic value of involving stakeholders. So why do you want to involve stakeholders? Well, that it can be because you think that involving stakeholders is the right thing to do. It's not a means to an end, but it can be an end in itself. A normative motive to involve stakeholders. And that's at the core of stakeholder theory from the beginning. And some branches have been focusing on other aspects later, but the normative core of stakeholder theory is certainly a key point in stakeholder theory literature. It can be just the right thing to do. So these are 4 very different motives to involve stakeholders, and perhaps you can come up with many more motives. There might be more to add to this list. My main point for today is that, well, who should you involve in your project and how should you involve them? Well, that depends on, are you involving them because you want a better decision, because you want to avoid resistance, build consensus? Do you want to improve relationships in general, or is it just because it's the right thing to do? So how do those relate? Well, let's first talk about what kind of stakeholders could you involve? Who to involve? What kind of stakeholders can be distinguished between? Well, Freeman in his book, 1984 book, has a definition of stakeholders that can already help in that respect. His definition is: stakeholders are groups and individuals who can affect or are affected by the achievement of an organization's mission. And this already has 2 groups. This definition already distinguishes between 2 groups of stakeholders: those that can affect you, but also those that are affected by you. And a typical procedure to identify stakeholders is drawing up a power interest matrix. You're probably familiar with that. A 2-dimensional matrix having power on one axis and interest on the other axis, and then you can plot the different stakeholders in that matrix. But then what? What is the implication of having stakeholders on that power interest grid? Should you only attend to those that are in the upper right part of this matrix? Well, my answer would be, well, it depends on your motive. So if your motive is to avoid resistance, to build consensus because you want to avoid resistance, well, then you should probably look at those that have high power, regardless of whether they have high interest or not. Because if they don't have high power, they cannot resist your implementation anyway. And this is very different from the situation where your motive is the normative motive, because you find it relevant to involve stakeholders as an end in itself. Then the power is not relevant. That is not that relevant. And probably it's the stakeholders which score low on power that need help getting involved. Those that score high on power can manage, they can look after their own interest. They have the power to make sure that the system evolves in the direction that aligns with their interests. But it's the stakeholders that score low on interest that might use your help, and that actually would be served by you involving them in your operational research project. So it really depends on your motive, who you should involve. And it can be helpful also in other papers in stakeholder theory to distinguish between the power, the legitimacy, and the urgency of stakeholders, to then connect the dots and connect who you want to involve to why you want to involve them. And then how do you involve your stakeholders? Well, there are also very different ways how you can involve them. There are many ladders of participation in the literature. There are different stages. There are ladders distinguishing 3 levels or 8 levels or 20 levels of how deeply you involve stakeholders. The very coarse distinction is, well, decision makers can involve stakeholders by taking them into account in how they approach the problem. They can think, stand in the shoes of stakeholders and try to take their interest into account. Or they can have one-way communication where they inform stakeholders about the operational research project and the preferred solutions that they want to implement and how they got to that solution. Or you can actually have two-way communication where you involve stakeholders in the decision-making process. And again, how you involve them is related to who to involve and why to involve. So if your goal is to build consensus, yeah, that's probably going to need more than just standing in the shoes of stakeholders. Then you probably need to deeply involve the stakeholders from begin to end to avoid cynicism, to avoid them having the perception that they are only involved symbolically. And yeah, I refer to the chapter to see the connection between the other types of how to involve stakeholders, who to involve, and why to involve them, to make sure that we have enough time for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Very well timed. So, and well, different talk from the other ones too. So I really enjoy this diversity. As far as I can tell, we have only one question, but this question has received by far the most endorsements. It's really non-compensatory if you consider all of the other comments. So I'm reading it. It's from Ian Mitchell. Supporting senior personality in an organization has often been vital in getting OR used in that organization. Do you have views on how to obtain this support?
How to get, so let's say, how to get sponsorship for your project, right?
And especially, I guess it's important that it's a senior personality in the organization.
Yeah, so, well, I can, my guess would be that you can apply some of those insights from stakeholder theory that I applied in this presentation on operational research projects in general. You can probably also apply them to this situation where you try to engage a senior personality.
Stakeholder theory, the ones you presented and possibly other ones that you didn't, don't have anything special to say about these senior personalities? And seniority here, I'm assuming, you know, it doesn't have only to do with age.
Sure. So, for example, it has been acknowledged in stakeholder theory how more in the descriptive branch, how strong the influence of senior personality is on the stakeholder orientation of an organization. So an organization can be said to have the ambition to take a wide range of stakeholders into account in their strategy, or they can be said to focus on shareholders, right? So shareholder value first. And that too is very strongly influenced by the senior personality and their preference with regard and their values with regard to should we pay attention to a broad range of stakeholders or prioritize shareholders.
Okay, yeah, that helps. I'm gonna read now an answer by Bob Scott, which is maybe a good way to end. It's very, very positive, very optimistic. So I was lucky, 3 CEOs, all with an OR education. Maybe I don't need to read the rest. It was a huge help and so on and so forth. So maybe we should all be so lucky.
And related to my presentation, I think this general motive of investing in relationship, I think that also applies to getting support from senior personality. So I really think you should be in it for the long run and invest with a relationship with the seniors in an organization to make sure that you get into a fruitful collaboration.
Great. Thank you, Vincent. Thanks, everyone, all the speakers, all the people who asked questions, all the people who didn't, but processed the answers and the questions. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to let you commute to your next session. Please do remember, you know, one thing you can do to keep up, to keep in touch with us is read the handbook, check out in the Behavioural OR SIG website in the OR Society, check out the NatCore website for upcoming course in Behavioural OR and so on and so forth. Thank you very much. Very nice to see you and see you next time.